Over the past 5 years, we've seen some massive shifts in the gaming laptop space. CPUs have gone from 8-core 16-thread setups to fully blown 24-core monsters. On the GPU side, we've climbed from RTX 2000 series to 3000 and then to 4000 series with big performance leaps along the way. And then with the new 5000 series, well, it hasn't been a huge jump. But when you zoom out and look at the overall evolution of gaming laptops, it's actually been pretty impressive. Manufacturers have stepped up with better cooling systems, faster displays, improved keyboards, and better battery life. So I thought, what if we compared the fastest gaming laptops from each generation? It'll give us the opportunity to not only evaluate performance, but also analyze the improvements that they've made over 6 generations. And if everything that I mentioned about improvements actually apply to this. And to do that, we needed a lot of support. So we are partnering with Legion and Intel for this project, and they were kind enough to send us every Legion 7 series laptop dating all the way back to 2020. We're starting with the very first Legion 7i laptop powered by Core i9-10980HK CPU with 8 cores, 16 threads, 32 gigabytes of RAM, a 2 terabyte SSD in RAID, and an RTX 2080 Max-Q GPU. Next up is the Gen 6 model featuring a Core i9-119HK with the same core and thread count, but they've upgraded it to an RTX 3080 laptop GPU. Then we move to Gen 7, where things get a little bit more serious. So Intel's 12th Gen Core i9-12900HX brought more threads into the mix to be competitive, and they paired it with an RTX 3080 Ti laptop GPU. We're skipping Gen 8 since the RTX 4000 series was pretty much spanned across 2 generations, and the Raptor Lake processors from Intel were essentially repackaged all the way to Gen 9. So this one features the Core i9-14900HX with 32 threads and an RTX 4090 laptop GPU. It also marks Legion's shift to the new Pro branding with the Pro 7i. Basically, the Pro series became more enthusiast-oriented with much higher power targets while sacrificing some compactness. Meanwhile, the regular 7i continued on with a slimmer, lighter design that uses a more efficient GPU and processor. Now finally, we have the Legion Pro 7i Gen 10. This thing is powered by Intel's Arrow Lake HX Core Ultra 9275X. Now, there's a reason for the thread reduction, and we'll talk about how that affects gaming performance later, but this one is paired to an RTX 5090 laptop GPU. I should mention right from the jump that we are looking at a pre-production unit here, so a few things aren't up to the level you'll see if you buy one today. Let's be honest here for a sec. The Legion 7i series was never what you'd call affordable. The 2020 model, for example, it launched just under $3,000. And with the arrival of the RTX 3000 series, we crossed the 3K mark. But the real shocker was the Gen 7 model with the RTX 3080 Ti. That thing introduced us to a whole new era of $4,000 gaming laptops. In 2024, we actually saw a slight dip in pricing. That's mostly because the GPUs were carried over from the previous year, and Intel's 14th gen didn't really bring any major performance gains over the 13th gen. But then came 2025, and the new Legion Pro 7i Gen 10, spec it out with an RTX 5090, and you're looking at $4,500 US. Even after factoring in inflation, pricing for high-end gaming laptops has gone up significantly. I should also mention that this is the best it gets for the Legion Pro 7i, and there are configurations of it that cost a lot less. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and I wanted to see what you can get today for roughly the same price as a 2020 model. And the answer might actually surprise you. It's actually this, the Legion Pro 5i, equipped with an RTX 5070. And it's priced around $2,400 to $2,600 US before discounts. Although I will mention that you should avoid the 5070 model at all costs because we've seen the 5070 Ti model dip below the RTX 5070 prices. I've always appreciated the Pro 5 series for its balance, performance, and price, but with this latest gen, Lenovo just seems to have stripped away everything that made it feel pro. So there's no RGB, it's got some basic cooling setups and a pretty uninspired design. I'm curious to find out how the performance stacks up against the Pro 7i and the generations that come before that. But before we get into that, let's talk about design differences, because a lot has changed over the years with the Legion Pro 7i and the 7i series. Now, back in 2020, Lenovo hit a major turning point with the Legion laptop. They completely overhauled their design language, moving away from plasticky and gamery looks of the past to something a lot more minimalist and just stealthy. The Legion logo was neatly tucked into the corner. You got ring lighting, which was pretty subtle, and the overall build felt much more premium with an all aluminum lid and the keyboard deck, although the rest of the materials were made out of plastic. And you know what? That formula clicked with a broader audience. I just loved the clean look. But that said, it wasn't perfect. I mean, this generation was notorious for the hinge creaking issues, and the chassis weighed around 5.25 pounds or 2.5 kilos with a Z height of 0.79 inches and 19.9 millimeters. Then came Gen 6 in 2021, which brought some major refinements. So this time, the chassis had more aluminum components, and they finally fixed the hinge, and they introduced a really sleek storm gray color that extended all the way to the rear I/O, completed with LED markers at the back, which just made finding ports a lot easier in darker environments. Love that detail. But more importantly, this was one of the first gaming laptops to feature a 16:10 display, and it was a total game changer. They also perfected the hinge and added a small lip right around the webcam, making it much more easier to open the lid with one hand. With Gen 7 from 2022, the design shift was more subtle but meaningful. Legion moved from sharp, edgy lines to rounded corners throughout the chassis, giving it a modern, low-profile aesthetic. They also added brushed aluminum accents along the edges, which really emphasized the premium look and feel of the laptop. And yet, somehow they managed to slim down the chassis to just 0.76 inches without increasing the weight. And I think that's likely due to the shift to a cold front vapor chamber cooling solution. Now, moving to Gen 9 from 2024, and this was a bit of a step back, at least visually. So they dropped the gray color in favor of an all matte black chassis. Legion also simplified the branding by removing the Y from the logo and just going with a simple plain O. This model used recycled aluminum and magnesium components to fulfill their sustainability approach. And just side by side, I just feel like the Gen 7, it just felt more premium compared to this one in the hand. The I/O extension was also redesigned, so the recessed grip zone from the Gen 7 was gone and was replaced with a flat layout. And to cool the RTX 4090, they increased the Z height to over 1 inches, and this thing also pushed the weight up by 0.7 pounds. Finally, we have the Legion Pro 7i Gen 10 for 2025. They've increased the depth of the chassis by 0.5 inch to accommodate better cooling and higher power allocations for the processor and graphics. It's a lot heavier as well. They've centralized the Legion logo, which just loses the subtlety. The matte black finish is still here, and it continues to be a fingerprint magnet. Visually, I mean, when you compare the Gen 10 to something like Gen 7 or Gen 8, those models just look cleaner and more distinctive. But what do you guys think about Legion's new design direction? To really show how these laptops have evolved over the past 5 years, let's take a closer look at the weight and thickness progression. From 2020 to 2025, there's been a clear upward trend, not just in specs, but in size. The Legion 7i has gradually shifted away from its roots in portability. So after a bump in thickness in 2021, Lenovo nailed it in 2022 with a sleek, lightweight design. But since then, the Pro 7i has ballooned in just every possible way. It's heavier, it's thicker, splashier. They've added more RGB, leading to a gamer aesthetic. If you want the portability aspect, the regular Legion 7i is still out there, though it only maxes out to an RTX 5070. But let's give Legion the benefit of the doubt for a second. They claim that the increased thickness allows for more thermal headroom, which in turn should lead to better performance. So is that true? Well, yes and no. It's clear that 2022 was the sweet spot. That year, Legion managed to strike a near perfect balance between power, thermals, and portability. You had top-tier performance in a relatively thin and lightweight chassis. It was peak optimization at the time. But ever since then, while the laptops have continued to grow in size, the actual power gains have started to plateau. I mean, sure, you're still getting bigger GPUs and higher wattage CPUs, but the returns aren't scaling the same way. So what does that all mean for gaming performance? Well, I wanted to pause here for a sec to explain a few things. First of all, the Legion 7i from 2021 is using an RTX 3080 16GB rather than the 8GB version that made its way into some laptops. If you come across a device with that lower memory footprint, avoid it at all costs. Also, we're testing all of these laptops in their highest non-overclocked power mode. So starting off with Alan Wake 2, and right away we see what'll become a pretty common narrative. The difference between the Legion 7i from 2020 and the RTX 3000 models is pretty massive for two reasons: architecture and wattage. basically going from a 95 watt max Q version to GPUs chugging back 150 watts or more. Then there's another big leap forward between the RTX 3080 Ti and 4090. Unfortunately, the benefits of going to the 1590 aren't that much, except those 1% lows do get a pretty good boost. Baldur's Gate shows pretty much the same thing, though with an even smaller advantage for the Pro 7i Gen 10. Although that Legion Pro 5i's performance falls right in line with the Legion 7i with an RTX 3080 Ti. We also end up seeing a lot better performance for both laptops over their predecessors in processor-intensive titles, where the GPU sort of takes a bit of a backseat to the CPU. And this is where Intel's new Core Ultra 9 275HX can really start to flex its muscles. While average frame rates still show, and I guess you could call them incremental improvements, it's actually those critical 1% lows that see the biggest benefits. I was actually surprised to see the Pro 5i following right along, since I thought that the RTX 5070 would be the limiting factor, but obviously not, which proves that pairing up a mid-tier GPU with one of Intel's most powerful laptop CPUs can still provide a net positive effect. But there are a few other games that really benefit the RTX 5000 series GPUs, with the Legion Pro 7i's 5090 finally opening up a bigger gap between the 2024 model's RTX 4090. But I also want to point out that even in best case scenarios like these, this is overall the smallest generational performance improvement we've seen in more than half a decade of Legion gaming laptops. The only thing that can really compare is the gap between the 3080 and the 3080 Ti, while the RTX 4090 ends up looking like a bolt of lightning in terms of frame rates. I also have some mixed feelings about the RTX 5070 in the Legion Pro 5i. Overall, it puts on a decent show, but generally better than the RTX 3080 and sometimes coming close to the RTX 3080 Ti, and both of those laptops cost a whole lot more. At least they used to. But let's not lose plot here, because we're comparing it to laptops that are 3 and 4 years old, and progress has obviously slowed with the RTX 5000 series. Plus, the RTX 5070 with its 8GB of memory, well, it just gets destroyed in some games like this one. Look, gaming performance is one thing, but the last thing anyone wants is to buy a laptop and just have its fans become screaming loud when a game starts loading up. And that's arguably where the biggest progress has made over the last few years. So let's first plot out where we stand from a GPU power standpoint, with it gradually increasing over time. But when you overlay noise on top of this, and that's actually decreased by a pretty big amount over the last 2 generations, with the 2025 Legion Pro 7i being the quietest of the bunch. And I say the quietest, but at 54 decibels, this thing is still a lot louder than a fully fledged desktop gaming PC. Now, if we factor in thickness into the equation, there's obviously a direct correlation between that and noise too, with the thinnest models also being the loudest. But that doesn't necessarily mean a thinner laptop will run hotter, because back in 2020, power and noise were obviously sacrificed to get lower temperatures, while the 2022 model's RTX 3080 Ti obviously pushed that vapor chamber heatsink to its limit. And now we're seeing Legion move towards more of a focus on noise and temperatures without cutting back on power. And unfortunately, that led to move away from their groundbreaking thin designs towards a much more traditional look. So basically, gaming performance seems to have reached a plateau on 2025 gaming laptops. But let's also talk about one of the areas that sees some of the biggest performance jumps, and that's with all-core workloads, mostly due to the changes Intel has done to their Ultra 9 200HX series, which has continued a constant upwards trend in both multi and single core workloads within Cinebench. So that gaming performance plateau, well, we can place that firmly on the GPU's shoulders. But you'll notice something else as well. The amount of power these CPUs need to get this level of performance has increased by a lot. In 2020, we were looking at 73 watts, whereas now the 275HX in the Pro 7i and the 5i gets fed with 147 watts and 125 watts respectively. And those numbers translate into really strong multi-core performance that should make everyone wonder what would have happened to gaming if GPU performance stuck to this trajectory as well. Either way, if you are running apps that need the best possible CPU output, then the 2025 models are by far the best choice. And yes, that means even the Pro 5i comes along for the ride. Now, when you look at apps like Photoshop that are more of a hybrid scenario, it loves CPU speeds while also benefiting from low latency memory and fast storage. So the benefits are a lot less here for both new laptops. But once we add the GPU into the equation, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag here too. In terms of raw compute horsepower, the Pro 7i is class leading, and the Pro 5i's RTX 5070, it gets some pretty solid numbers as well. And yet, they both seem oddly capped in our Handbrake transcoding test, likely because the app doesn't support the multi-encode and decode engine layouts of the new GPUs. However, the gloves come off in Annalise with the Pro 7i being on a completely different planet when compared against previous generations. Even the Pro 5i's RTX 5070 puts in some very competitive numbers, with it easily beating the RTX 3080 Ti. This all comes down to a blend of NVIDIA's multi-NVENC engine approach on the 5090, along with a processor that does really well in more heavy threaded workloads. Another thing I wanted to discuss is battery life, because these are laptops. If you wouldn't care about battery life and portability, you probably shouldn't be buying a laptop in the first place. You should look towards desktops. But anyways, get ready for a shock here, because the Pro 7i Gen 10 might reverse a downwards trend for battery life that's been going on ever since 2022. It still gets overtaken by an older laptop that has less battery capacity and probably has a bit of degradation as well. Again, the Pro 7i series has now become a quasi-desktop replacement that sacrifices some portability and efficiency for performance. If you want a battery life champ, the regular 7i is still around, but on the other hand, with its smaller battery, the Pro 5i does get decent results. The same goes for streaming content, with the Pro 7i and 5i both getting under 5 hours of playback. I mean, this is really eye-opening in a really sad way, isn't it? We don't realize what we've lost in terms of battery life on modern laptops until looking further back in time. The only outlier is gaming, where the newest laptops give the longest time away from the charger, and it isn't even close. They're way far out ahead. And I'm sure I know what you're thinking right now, because I thought the same thing as well. Does the huge advantage in gaming battery life translate into terrible frame rates? Has Legion essentially cut power too much in order to get more runtime? Well, the answer to that is no. Not only does the new Pro 7i and 5i get almost 2 hours of gameplay from a full charge, but they actually maintain performance by a whole lot better than any of the previous generation devices. I mean, check this out. While there's a huge gap right now on battery, with even the 5070 coming close to the 4090's numbers, that wasn't the case when these things were plugged in. This happened in every other game that we tested, the Pro 5i showing up between 3080 and 3080 Ti, while the Pro 7i ended up at most 20% ahead of its predecessor. Then you run on battery and the situation changes completely, with almost all of the previous generation laptops failing to deliver consistently playable performance. Things also get even more interesting in multi-core workloads. This is Cinebench plugged in, and here's what happens on battery. The 2025 models leads are getting exponentially bigger. And the same goes for Handbrake as well. Here's plugged in, and then the system on battery. I mean, the new laptops just run away. Now, I want to shift the conversation to the interior space of these laptops, specifically with the keyboard and trackpads. Have they progressed? Let's start with the keyboard. So the 2020 Legion 7i was the first to introduce a full-size keyboard with a numpad, and honestly, it was a solid move. Lenovo debuted their True Strike keyboard with this generation, and it brought over some of that beloved ThinkPad DNA. So you've got stable keystrokes, satisfying travel, and the overall feel that just worked equally well for gamers and hardcore typists. From Gen 6 all the way to Gen 9, that keyboard consistency stuck. No major layout changes, there are barely any keyboard flex, and yeah, for the most part, they were built pretty well and they were enjoyable keyboards. Except Gen 10, for some reason, well, if you've used a Legion keyboard, it'll feel familiar with the dish-style design, generous key spacing, and a full-size layout with a numpad, but it doesn't feel like the same keyboard I've come to love. It's less tactile and seems like a bit of a regression. As for RGB lighting, initially was a bit rough. Legion initially partnered with Corsair using their IQ software for customization. It was a terrible move. It was chaotic. There were lots of crashes. If you've owned one of those laptops, you know what I'm talking about. And thankfully, they eventually phased that out and brought in RGB control through Lenovo's own Vantage software, which made things a lot more stable and user-friendly. The brightness across the keys have pretty much remained consistent. I should also point out that with Gen 8 in 2023, Lenovo removed the fingerprint sensor that was previously integrated into the power button. It was a small convenience feature, but still a major loss in my opinion. When it comes to trackpad, it's been a mixed bag, all right? The original Legion 7i had a decent-sized trackpad, but it wasn't glass, and navigating around Windows felt a bit sticky and unrefined. Even with the latest Gen 10 models, or specifically the Pro 7i, Lenovo is still using the same Mylar-treated surface. I mean, it gets the job done, but at this price, it just feels like a bit of a letdown, especially when their own Legion 9i comes with a beautiful glass trackpad that feels miles better than what this thing offers. So yeah, they can do it, they just haven't yet on the Pro 7i. Now let's talk ports, because this was yet another area where Legion nailed it back in 2020. That's the year that featured smart, user-friendly layouts that most of the layouts were actually at the back for easier cable management, and I loved it. It was such an awesome feature of these laptops. You got all the essentials, including full-size Type-A, Thunderbolt, HDMI, and Ethernet, and credit where it's due, that rear I/O layout pretty much stuck throughout the next 4 generations. Speeds have also increased over time, especially with faster Thunderbolt implementations and HDMI getting some updates as well. Then came Gen 10, and things changed. They've completely eliminated the rear ports, opting instead to move all of them towards the left and right sides of the chassis. And in doing so, they've stripped away one of Legion's most iconic and practical features. You know what's really frustrating is that some of the I/O specs haven't kept up. For instance, some of the USB Type-A ports are still stuck to 3.2 Gen 1, 5 gigabits per second, where Gen 2, 10 gigabits per second should absolutely be standard on a device labeled Pro. I should also mention that RGB lighting has been scaled back over time. Well, kind of. Gen 6 had well-lit vents and a U-shaped RGB wrap. Gen 7 dialed it back. Gen 8, Gen 9, and Gen 10 went with a single RGB strip facing the user. And then Gen 10 also brings some ambient lighting around the exhaust vents. While the diffusion is beautiful, it just reminds me of another laptop. If you know, you know. Okay, let's talk displays, because over the years, Legion has made some pretty big moves here. Back in 2020, the Legion 7i came with a 15.6-inch 1080p IPS panel with 144Hz refresh rate and support for G-Sync. Nothing groundbreaking for now, but at the time it was pretty amazing. Then came 2021, and this is where things really started to evolve. They upgraded to a 16:10 display, bumped the resolution to Quad HD Plus, and increased the refresh rate to 165Hz. That new aspect ratio alone was a game changer for both gaming and productivity. And you know what? That formula worked really well through Gen 7, Gen 8, and Gen 9. With Gen 7, they introduced a 240Hz option, and honestly, the experience was buttery smooth. But then came 2025, and Legion made a bold move. They switched to OLED. Now look, display quality is subjective, and I get that. On paper, OLED sounds like an upgrade. You get 100% DCI-P3 coverage, better color accuracy than previous generations thanks to their tuning partner X-Rite. You get deeper blacks, but to me personally, these colors are just a bit too oversaturated for my taste. The biggest trade-off is especially with brightness output, especially in SDR. These new OLED panels are dimmer than last year's IPS displays, and it actually gets worse. They're also super glossy with no anti-reflective coating on it. So if you're using this laptop in a bright room setting or next to a window, well, good luck. The glare is real. There's also the issue of PWM flickering, which OLED panels are notoriously bad for. If you're sensitive to flicker, especially at lower brightness levels, this could be a deal breaker. The previous generation IPS panels had DC dimming and no flicker issues, and it was a far more comfortable experience. So while OLED might look great on a spec sheet, in day-to-day use, I just feel like this switch might actually feel like a downgrade for a lot of users. Now, upgradability has been pretty flexible with the Legion 7i series. It's been pretty straightforward with quick access to 2 SODIMM slots. You also get access to 2 M.2 slots for storage expansion. Gen 10 sort of beefs it up a little bit, so you get an extra fan for cooling. You still get access to memory and storage. I'm glad that they didn't remove that. And in terms of SSD performance, read and write speeds have almost doubled over the past 5 generations. This is what the webcam looked like on the 2020 Legion 7i. They used a 720p sensor, and of course the microphone needed a lot more tuning back in the day. This is what the Gen 10 Legion Pro 7i looks like. It is a higher resolution sensor, so it's a lot more detailed. You get a slightly wider field of view, and of course they've made some improvements to the microphone quality as well. So let me know, what do you guys think about that improvement? You know, I genuinely loved the direction Legion was heading, especially with the older Legion 7i laptops. It felt like a gaming laptop that didn't scream gamer. It was powerful, well-built, thoughtfully designed, and it had a certain identity. But with these newer generations, especially the Pro 7i Gen 10 and the Pro 5i Gen 10, I get it. Legion needed a series of laptops that could have Legion 9i components without the Legion 9i's price, so they broke the 7 series into two, with the Pro 7i becoming less portable but more powerful, while a regular 7i is all about compactness. But in many ways, that caused the Pro 7i to just feel like another aggressive gaming laptop right now. It isn't unique anymore. And maybe that works for some. But for those of us who loved Legion for its balance of performance, design, and subtlety, this new direction, it's just hard not to feel a little disappointed. Plus, when you add the whole RTX 5000 fiasco, and yeah, it makes us feel less excited these days about what's out there. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.